So, while wasting my time looking through more old C4 and C5 PvP videos, I started to notice a couple of interesting things. And this led me to take a deeper dive into the relevant patch notes as well as some specific research. So I decided to make a video about what I have discovered so far and what I worked out, as well as to take a more in-depth look specifically in the Chronicle 5 and Interlude patch notes about what changes were made to the various skills. Now, I'm not going to repeat my points from the previous video, specifically regarding Greater Heal, Major Heal and Sleep. You should be familiar to those by now, but there is still quite a lot of ground to cover, even counting those out. So before we begin, let's take a little overview on how to recognize what Chronicle a video is from. So should you want to look into these things yourself, you're going to be able to recognize what you're looking at. Of course, if the video itself is dated, you can tell what Chronicle it is from by looking at the date from when that Chronicle was released to the public. Now obviously, like 98-99% of the PvP videos we have are from the NA and EU servers, and you can see pretty much the release dates of the various Chronicles on the Kaganpwnz website, which as far as I know are accurate. So you can always reference those to look at what a video is from if you know the actual date. But of course, the vast majority of videos do not mention their exact date, so let's go over it. Chronicle 3 is the last Chronicle that had the narrow CP bar, as well as a flat image on the ground projected for when you click to move. Chronicle 4 was the first one that had the large CP bar in view, and it introduced the 3D movement marker that we've come to know since. It also introduced S-grade and heroes and noblesse, so if you see any of those things, it's already an easy indication that it's not Chronicle 3, but the CP bar is obviously the easiest tell that something is not C3 anymore. By itself, Chronicle 5 looks extremely similar to Chronicle 4. The two main ways to tell it apart is the fact that you have Chronicle 5 skills present, and because of all the changes to clans that Chronicle 5 made, anyone that's being targeted will now also show their rank, which in Chronicle 4 was just a blank space. So it will show like here, Viscount, or like, you know, Knight, something like that. So those are the two things to look out for to distinguish Chronicle 5 from Chronicle 4. Now for identifying Interlude, I'm gonna go completely off script for a bit because I've revised this like 3 times by now. Originally I thought it was easy because it was like, oh, it's when you have the multiple hotbars, but it turns out that was added somewhere relatively early in Chronicle 5. So the main way to tell Interlude would again be, unfortunately, either knowing the date of the video or simply spotting skills that were only there in Interlude. Now there weren't too many of these, so I'm thinking like Break Duress or like the physical ability to escape shackles from daggers, as well as any of the celestial skills, but most of the skills that were introduced were really high level, and so you don't really see them in PvP videos at all either way. Obviously, you can also reverse engineer critical damage, which I'm gonna get into all of this stuff later. Unfortunately, even the Interlude patch notes aren't very clear on this, because one of the things mentioned is that dash was changed in Interlude, but it turns out that this was changed several months before Interlude. It was probably an intermediary patch of some kind. So as it turns out, it's actually very hard to spot what is Interlude. Obviously, if the folded out bar for the hotbars isn't there, we know it is definitely before Interlude, but that does mean it could still be Chronicle 5. So unfortunately, it's really hard to differentiate Interlude from Chronicle 5, far more so than differentiating Chronicle 5 from Chronicle 4. But just know that most likely, if the UI shows these things, it is probably Interlude. After Interlude, of course, the UI was completely overhauled, and you have the more rounded UI style, kind of like Windows Aero, and any client with this UI is either from CT1 KML or later. And though it's not part of the scope of this video, Vitality was introduced at the start of Gracia Part 1, so if you see a rounded UI without the little Vitality bar, that means it's either KML or Hellbound. So what interesting things did I see? Well, let's start off with something that isn't in any patch notes as far as I can tell. But I've also never noticed this effect on any private server, so I'm not sure if it's ever been implemented or if maybe I've just been completely blind, but I don't think so. And that is that the resistances against specific debuffs also affect the damage of those debuff skills. Now, I noticed this mostly when someone was using a couple stun shots on a guy in Majestic, and he was doing like very low damage on stun shot. Now, we'll see later in the patch notes that the actual damage to stun was buffed in like 3 different ways. But we can also very clearly see that the resistance against stun does actually have an effect on how much damage a stun does. This was most clearly demonstrated in an Aimful Olympiad video. Here he fights Shadowman, and immediately afterwards he fights another Silver Ranger called Linky. Now, if you want to read the details, I'm going to put them on screen here. Safe to say, I run the numbers, they never line up exactly, which probably has something to do with how con or how the numbers are calculated, I don't know. But it's very clear when you look at it that if we assume that Shadowman has full epics, or mostly full epics, that the damages do line up, because when you look especially like at how much damage Aimful does to Linky afterwards, the numbers are completely out of proportion. To finish up this point, I don't know when, if ever, this mechanic was changed at all, but I've only found I've not found any mention in the patch notes, and I personally do not have a lot of videos from after Interlude, so I do not know when it was changed. And of course after Interlude with Dynasty and the various armors, it becomes a lot harder to tell when someone has a lot of stun resistance, and of course more people will have epics overall because there's been more time to farm them. You saw the same thing on Reborn originally, where the later on in the server, the more people overall will have epics, and it becomes harder to tell, like, oh, this person does less damage because he's a Majestic, versus this person has Majestic and 2 epics, and that other person has like 5 epics. And it becomes a lot harder to tell the later on in Chronicles you go. So now let's go to the actual patch notes, but we're gonna start with a small point from Chronicle 4. We see here on point 6, the probability that cancel will remove buffs and debuffs has been considerably reduced, and the reuse time has been decreased from 300 to 120 seconds. Now I've got 3 videos that I've found on this so far, 2 of which show cancel as used by a spellsinger or sorcerer, and 1 that shows a cancelstick. And finally, there's a few videos that I had come across that show the cooldown on the cancel, though I've not referenced those. But you can basically look at like any sorcerer or spellsinger video from that era, and if you can nail it down to be Chronicle 4, you will kind of see the cooldown. The one that I saw had like dances and Zerg and Acumen, but no prophecy. And the cooldown on cancel there was about 50 seconds. So let's start with a very small demonstration of what cancel was like before Chronicle 4. In this infamous video, Why Blue Hates Cancel, we can see that 20 out of 20 buffs get cancelled. Every single one. In Chronicle 4 it says that the chance was considerably reduced, so let's have a look at what considerably reduced actually means. This first video is Kaganpwnz's Exitkp, and we can see here that he loses 12 out of the 16 buffs he has. Obviously this is still catastrophic, and we can see why not many of them can be found in people's PvP videos. He still ended up winning this fight, but I doubt we would have seen this if he had lost that fight, and that's probably why we don't see this too much. The second is Kafaya's Blaze versus Catalyst SOA, and here we can see him losing 14 out of 19 buffs. Again, massively catastrophic for him, and he pretty much immediately died as a result of it. And then the third one we see is Aeze's Uprising versus Dynasty, or the file that I have on my computer personally is called Dynasty Final. And here we can see a cancelstick removing 12 out of 18 buffs with 1 swing. Noblesse, as far as I know, cannot be cancelled, so it doesn't count towards the total. In the Chronicle 5 patch notes, we can see that the maximum number of buffs that get cancelled has been limited to 5 at maximum, which is how we know cancel to work nowadays. But this means for a brief time in Chronicle 4, cancel will still be hugely overpowered, and even with ideal buffs the cooldown will still be around a minute long, so yeah, I just figured you probably would like to know that in Chronicle 4 we're still gonna have a pretty crazy cancel. Now we're gonna finally move on to the actual patch notes, starting with Chronicle 5. Point 1, the abnormal state of various magic resistance was changed from wit to men. I don't know which debuffs this affects, but it's safe to assume that it's pretty much all of them, which means in Chronicle 4 they're gonna be determined by wit, and in Chronicle 5 they're gonna be determined by men, which is gonna make it a lot harder for fighters because they just can't get a plus wit die and actually get some resistances. Point 3, the effect and duration of skills that reduce speed has been reduced. Now, I don't really have the means to test how much the effect was reduced, like the actual power of the skill, but we can see in both Kafaya's Gludio Castle December 17th from 1 minute 12 to 3 minute 11 with an entangle, as well as Kafaya's Blaze vs SoA Forge of Gods from 0:44 to 2 minutes 45 seconds, that these slows, which was a cripple by the way, that these slows lasts for 2 minutes instead of the 30 seconds that we've become used to after Interlude. So, theoretically speaking, if you're fighting a guy in an Olympiad match, you only need to land slow 3 times to have him slowed for the entire match. And of course, we don't have cleanse yet, which means that slow is going to become a lot stronger in Chronicle 4 than we're used to, especially for dealing with melee classes like daggers and destros and tanks. A side note is that I also came across a Kafaya video where he got slowed by a mob, and that one also lasted 2 minutes, so be aware of this when you're going to be pulling trains. Point 5. Curiously, until Chronicle 5, there was no cancel resist element within Ultimate Evasion, Ultimate Defense, Touch of Life, Vengeance or Lionheart. So on top of all the aforementioned things with Chronicle 4's cancel, there's no easy way for most fighter classes to temporarily boost their cancel resist. It's probably going to be a bit hard to preempt when cancel happens anyway, and let's be honest, it probably won't make much of a difference even if they did have cancel resist in them. But yeah, you're basically, if you get cancelled, you're just screwed. In points 10 through 14, we see a bunch of Gladiator and Tyrant things that were changed in Chronicle 5. I only have rather cursory knowledge of these classes, and I've never played them on like an actual low-rate server, and definitely not in depth enough to be able to evaluate any of these changes. So if you play either of these classes, just have a look over them. Know that they're pretty different in Chronicle 4 than what you're used to, but I honestly have no idea. I'm not gonna go in depth with these. You just look at them. Number 17, Rage and Frenzy. We're pretty much buffed for two-handed swords and both one- and two-handed blunts, as far as I can read, while every other type of weapon will have it become weaker. So a destro with a sword will be less dangerous in Chronicle 4 than it is how we're used to in Interlude, but it will be more dangerous when using a bow. Again, I don't know exactly how much this changed, but let's just go with the general sense of like, it's dangerous. Number 19, this is also a pretty interesting one. The recovery time and MP consumption of Dash and Blinding Blow have been reduced and the skill's duration has been increased. I've not been able to really find Blinding Blow, but I also, to be honest, haven't really looked very much for a Chronicle 4 Planeswalker or Abyss Walker video. But we can very easily spot in a few of DVP videos, including 1409-2006 at 1 minute 44, as well as his 060606 video, as shown in the background here, that dash only lasts for 10 seconds, whereas in later chronicles it lasts for 15 seconds. Also, if I compare the cooldown in this video that we're looking at compared to DVP's 070107, where he has pretty much the same buffs, we can see that Dash's cooldown is approximately 6 minutes longer than it is in Chronicle 5 and later, which translates to going from about 52 seconds in Interlude to 5 minutes and 12 seconds in Chronicle 4. So Dash is going to be a lot less useful and ubiquitous, and you definitely would not be able to use it on cooldown continuously. Number 20, Lethal Strike changes. Now, I've not even attempted to look into this, because good luck finding anything on that, but the way I read it is that lethal was changed to be exactly how we know it to be in Interlude. But then when I look at the C4 patch notes, where lethal blow and lethal shot were introduced, the description is pretty much exactly the same as what it is later on. So I have no idea how lethal worked in Chronicle 4, and if anyone has anything on this, I would love to see it, because I have no idea. Points 21 and 22, we can see that Deadly Blow, Blinding Blow and Backstab will now be able to do lethals. So up to this point, these skills were not able to do lethal strikes. I believe only Lethal Blow and Lethal Shot were able to do any kind of lethal, and no other skill was able to do it. This is a mind-blowingly major buff for daggers, and it's going to be very rough for them in Chronicle 4, especially of course when they're facing off against tanks. And similarly in number 22 and 24 we see that both Backstab and Double Shot were not able to get crits before C5. This means that they're pretty much always gonna do the same amount of damage. They're not gonna randomly do double their damage that they did before. Number 23, Stun Shot, Trick and Switch got a cancel target effect. Now, I'm not sure how this works for Trick and Switch in PvP. The target cancelling is pretty much all I know these skills for, but Stun Shot I do know. And after this change, it means that you can fail to land the stun, but it will still have a chance to cancel the target regardless, and because of that, you can potentially interrupt a skill that they are casting at that time. Number 25, Snipe was buffed. I have no idea by how much. I'm not sure if it even matters at all, but if you're a Hawkeye player, you probably would like to know that in Chronicle 4, Snipe is even more useless. And then we move on to point 32. Sorcerers, Spell Howlers and Spell Singers can now learn Fear. So in Chronicle 4 they cannot fear in either PvE or PvP, so you don't have that lifeline for you, but let's be honest, with the cancel that they get, at least 2 out of the 3 classes listed over here are probably not going to care that they're not gonna have fear, because they're gonna have cancel. Point 34 and 35, Zerg and Holy Weapon can now only be cast on party members. So before Chronicle 5 you did not to be in a party with someone or something, like a raid boss, to give them Zerg. This will open up a lot more opportunity for overbuffing during PvP, giving someone who doesn't want the P defense or M defense penalties from Zerg to give them Zerg. And then they have the penalties from Zerg. Though of course it's also worth noting that this will make the life of buffers at MDT a lot easier as well. And apparently Zerg did not reduce evasion before Chronicle 5, but of course the other penalties are still in place. Number 43, the effect of Mental Shield has been decreased. I, again, have absolutely no idea how much this does. I doubt it's going to offset the power of Sleep in Chronicle 4, or the 2-minute slows that you can get, but it's probably gonna do at least something. If you have any information on this, I would absolutely love to hear it as well. And then point 48, Transfer Pain only works when the servitor is near the player. I have no idea what the range limitations on this is before or after, because I literally never played a summoner. So if you are a summoner, let me know what the range is from where your Transfer Pain stops working in Interlude. Though I would assume that, how I read this, probably I believe you still needed to have the servitor at least like rendered, so the hit points bar of the servitor is on your screen for it to work. But beyond that, there was like no range limitation, so you can put it like on the other end of where the game is rendering for you in the area and it will work. But I don't know what the range was after that, so that's what I expect anyway. Which, now that I think of it, might also be yet another reason why Necromancer was so popular back in the day, because there was like no limitation to this stuff. So that completes Chronicle 5. It's quite a long list, and for certain classes, such as daggers with their lethals, and of course nukers with their cancel, there are a lot of very dramatic changes in this. Of course, probably the more impactful thing are the new skills that were introduced in Chronicle 5, but there are still a lot of changes. Moving on to Interlude, thankfully it's a considerably shorter list, but still very impactful. Unfortunately, NCSoft didn't really bother to put numbers on this list like they did with the last one, so it's going to be a lot less nice to run through. Jumping ahead in the list, let's go straight for the most important change in Interlude, which is the effect of the following skills has been decreased. Maximum damage effect during a critical attack: Death Whisper, Dance of Fire, Eye of Pagrio, and Chant of Rage. That's right, critical damage from Death Whisper and Dance of Fire was nerfed. Now, I have been told that the number has gone from 50% to 35%. Taking a look at an engagement between Kafaya and some NPCs, as I'm showing in the background, from the video Gludio Castle July 16, 2006, we get a good number of shots from him to average out the damage numbers on these NPCs. And later on in the video we can see that he does not have any rings for epics, so we know that his crit damage is from his buffs only. Throwing these numbers on screen, you can pause to read the breakdown if you want, but basically this means that so long as you have Death Whisper and Dance of Fire, you will do 23.5% more critical damage in Chronicle 4 and Chronicle 5, as compared to having the same buffs in Interlude, irrelevant of what other critical buffs you may have. So even if you are a casual player, as long as you're playing a fighter, you're going to feel this change, and you're going to be doing more critical damage. Next point on the list, Elven Elders and Chilean Elders can no longer recharge themselves or each other. So up to this, Chronicle 4 and Chronicle 5, they could recharge, literally recharge themselves, as well as each other. Which, if you're used to playing Interlude or later Chronicles, which, let's be honest, all of us are at this point, that's gonna sound absolutely bananas. And you can probably stack this with some skills like Song of Renewal to get infinite mana, especially in Chronicle 5 when Clarity comes around. But at the same time, you have to remember that Interlude introduced both Mass Recharge and Invocation. And what these skills do really well is create a lot of mana very quickly. So efficient recharging is going to be a much more time-consuming process. It's going to be a lot harder to do on the fly during PvPs, and it's probably not as overpowered as it will appear at first glance. Soulshots now also increase skill damage. Now, I don't know if this is all skills, it's a very long list, but I do see every single physical archer attack skill in this list, which is so I assume pretty much every single skill is affected by this. And also I have no idea how much this actually does. But when looking at like the various attack skills that I looked at for the stun shot damage thing earlier, I would assume, comparing them to how I'm used to them in the Interlude, is probably about a 50% or greater increase. Quite a lot of these skills looked very, very, very weak in the Chronicle 4 Olympiad, and that is all the more reason to rely on that sweet increased critical damage modifiers that you will enjoy in Chronicle 4 and Chronicle 5. Then we have the Overlord, which gets an overall buff to its debuff land rates. I have, once again, no clue how much this actually does, but Overlords, rejoice! You get both Flames of Invincibility, Victories of Paragil, and you get increased debuff land rates. Truly, Interlude is the Overlord Chronicle, if anything. Then it says the effect of Deflect Arrow level 2, 3 and 4 have been greatly increased. Now unfortunately a lot of the PvP videos from Blade Dancers and Sword Singers back in the day that I do have, they don't use Deflect Arrow, and the ones where I do have them using Deflect Arrow, I don't have enough material to really compare when they get hit by someone with the skill on versus when they don't have the skill. Like they either have it on or they have it off, or it's not like the same. There's not videos with the same person doing both scenarios against similar opponents that I have or can find. So I don't know how much this was changed. If you know like a Sword Singer or a Blade Dancer that made a lot of videos back in the day, and you can find instances where they fight the same people, and one instance he has Deflect Arrow, and another instance they don't, I would love to hear it, because as an archer, naturally, I'm very interested in what this actually entails. But as it stands, greatly increased in Interludes, we don't know. We can only guess that tanks are gonna be a little bit easier to kill as an archer, which does not say that much, but we'll see how it works out. And finally, we have a change that will have absolutely no effect on Signature, but it's still interesting to see. Characters moving in stealth will become partially see-through. So before this, characters would be opaque regardless, and you would only be able to tell if they were in stealth or not, or silent move or not, by the speed difference. Obviously, this is pretty much entirely client-side and dependent on the client having the ability to render the character in this way. So I doubt we're going to be using an authentic C4 or C5 client. So it's probably not that, but it's still interesting to see that this is the point at which that effect was introduced to the game. And to add a few final notes of random things that I came across that aren't in the patch notes. Apparently, Summon Friend was also a new skill introduced with Interlude, and near as I can find, because that's when the spellbook was originally introduced. I cannot find reference of this in any of the patch notes, and we know the skill exists in Interlude. As far as I can tell, it was introduced with Interlude. I don't know why it's not in the patch notes, and similarly, the summoning crystals, the crystals that allow you to directly teleport up the floors of Tower of Insolence, also did not exist until Interlude. So Interlude, on top of, or like Chronicle 4, on top of missing all of the Noblesse teleports and all those things, also is going to have no Summon Friend, no like gate chant. Anywhere you want to go in the world, you have to actually go there. This is gonna be quite interesting to see how this is gonna work out for big clans and big sides fighting over epics like Bayum or like Valakas or Antheras, because to get to Antheras, you cannot just teleport to Heart anymore. You cannot summon anyone to Heart, you cannot go to Bridge. You have to run all the way in from the entrance of Lair of Antheras. And the same for Tower of Insolence. You're gonna have to run up all of those floors. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that's going to play out. Like, if you actually win a fight, you pretty much dominate that area for quite a while before the other side can come back, and vice versa and other things. Like, it's just going to be really interesting to see how that's going to work out. Another thing that I spotted during looking around is that in Chronicle 4, apparently, the Olympiad Stadium does not have any limits. Now, I've not been able to find too many videos of this, I just happened to come across this. So if you happen to have more Chronicle 4 videos for Olympiad, I would love to see them. But as far as I can tell, there's no limit. The limit is the actual literal wall. So the size of the arena is even bigger than it is in Interlude. And of course I should add that this is not listed in any patch notes that I can find. Interestingly as well, when I was looking at those patch notes, apparently Chronicle 5 introduced hero skills. So in Chronicle 4, if you get a hero, you get the tokens and you get a weapon, and that's it. You don't get Hero Zerk, you don't get Miracle, you don't get Grandeur, you just get being a hero, and the skills come in Chronicle 5 and later. Which is also interesting, because you're going to have the OP cancelstick, but you're not going to have the hero skills. So in a way, I suppose that kind of balances it out again as well. I don't know. So yeah, this is pretty much like the more impactful changes that were introduced in C5 and Interlude. Obviously, the entire list is a little bit longer, but most of them are just kind of like mana increase on this or a little decrease on that. You can go through the lists yourself as well, but these are just the things that I found. And to close out the video, I would like to once again remind you that Interlude did indeed finally stop supporting Windows 98. Rest in peace, Windows 98. Rest in peace.